This man's life is the kind of story that makes you realize just how uneventful your own is. Gregor MacGregor was a soldier, a pirate, a brigadier general who fought for 5 different armies across 3 continents. He was a revolutionary who stood at the head of not one but 2 uprisings at the same time, and he carved out his place in history as one of the most brilliant con artists who ever lived, and most of that he accomplished before he even turned 30. Picture a land untouched by civilization, waiting to bloom under your guiding hand. A place where the soil is so fertile that a single kernel of corn yields not 1 but 3 harvests a year. Imagine rivers so clear and cool you can see every stone beneath the surface, and along their banks among smooth pebbles lie nuggets of pure gold, just waiting for someone to pick them up. Envision forests dense with game, an air so clean and invigorating that it cures ailments and restores a vigor you've never known back in the damp, fog-soaked Isles of Albion. This isn't a fantasy. It isn't a legend. This is poyais. At least, that's what one man claimed. In the early 1820s, from London's fashionable drawing rooms to the rain-washed streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow, one name was on everyone's lips. Poyais, a young, promising nation on the Mosquito Coast of Central America. A paradise for investors, a promised land for settlers. And at the head of this flourishing country stood none other than a fellow Scotsman, His Highness Gregor MacGregor, the cacique of Poyais. A hero of the Venezuelan War of Independence, a general whose name echoed across South America, a descendant of the ancient and proud clan that counted Rob Roy himself among its own. He didn't just tell stories about his country, he provided proof. Here was a map, meticulous and richly detailed, marked with rivers, cities, and roads. Here was a flag, a graceful green cross on a field of white, the symbol of new hope. And here was a 300-page book, written by a certain Captain Thomas Strangeways, describing everything with almost obsessive precision, from a tri-chambered parliament to the varieties of tropical birds. The book even detailed the capital city, St. Joseph, with its wide paved boulevards, colonnaded buildings, an opera house, and a royal palace. For the Scots, whose national pride still smarted from the humiliating failure of the Darien colony a century earlier, this was a second chance, a chance they could not afford to miss. At last, Scotland would have its own prosperous colony, its own foothold in the New World, one that would finally wipe the smug smiles off English faces. And people believed. They brought MacGregor their savings, purchasing land certificates at 4 shillings per acre. They eagerly traded their solid British pounds for crisp, newly printed poyais dollars, produced, incidentally, by the official engraver of the Bank of Scotland. Work buzzed in the London docks and the port of Leith. Blacksmiths, doctors, lawyers, young officers who had bought commissions in the poyais army, and even a cobbler from Edinburgh who proudly bore the title official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, all packed their belongings. They loaded onto ships their furniture, their tools, plows, and most importantly, their hopes. In the autumn of 1822, the first ship, the Honduras Packet, cast off its lines. 70 settlers stood on deck, waving their hats to the crowd left behind on shore. Above the mast, the green cross flag fluttered proudly in the wind. The cacique himself, Gregor MacGregor, was there to see them off, shaking hands and wishing them luck in building a new world. In January of 1823, a second ship followed, the Kennersley Castle, carrying nearly 200 more hopeful souls. 2 months across the Atlantic only strengthened their belief. They imagined the thriving port that would welcome them, pictured their first steps onto the paved waterfront of St. Joseph, and breathed, if only in their minds, the healing air of their new homeland. And then, at last, land. The captain announced their arrival at the mouth of the Black River, the main port of Poyais. Dressed in their best clothes, the passengers rushed to the deck, but what they saw had nothing to do with the engravings from the guidebook. Instead of a bustling harbor, they were met with a crushing silence, broken only by the cries of unfamiliar birds and the droning of insects. Instead of a city with colonnades, there stood an impenetrable wall of green, alive with both life and death. Thick, humid air, heavy as syrup, hit them in the face. There were no docks, no buildings, no people, nothing, only a swampy shore and endless, indifferent jungle. There must be a mistake, they thought. The captain must have drifted off course. This couldn't be poyais, but it was. This was the promised land. There was no St. Joseph, no fields, no roads, no palaces. Everything existed only on paper and in the imagination of one man. Abandoned by their ship's captain, who, having fulfilled his contract, fled this cursed place as fast as he could, the settlers were trapped. Instead of a healing climate, they were met by tropical storms, yellow fever, and malaria. Instead of abundant game, venomous snakes and starvation. Instead of gold, mud and despair. Their crisp poyais dollars turned out to be worth less than autumn leaves. The hope that had carried them across an ocean guttered like a candle in the wind, replaced by terror. How? How could one man orchestrate a fraud on such a scale? How did he manage to deceive not only hundreds of hopeful settlers, but also sell shares of a non-existent country on the prestigious London Stock Exchange, raising capital that today would be counted in billions? How did he make not just common people, but bankers, aristocrats, and politicians believe his lies? And why, even after the truth came out, did some survivors defend him to the very end, insisting that the great cacique had simply been misled by his subordinates? To understand the nature of this genius of deception, this Napoleon of fraud, we must return to the very beginning to see how an ambitious young Scotsman became the man who created an entire country out of thin air and lies. His name was Gregor MacGregor, and his story is only just beginning. How does a person reach the point where he can, with cold calculation, send hundreds of his countrymen to their deaths? Was Gregor MacGregor born a monster? To understand that, we have to look into his past, a past that was itself his first and perhaps greatest invention. He was born in 1786 in Scotland, into a family belonging to the famed McGregor clan, the same clan that produced the legendary outlaw Rob Roy. Adventure and daring, one might say, were in his blood. At least, that's the version he would tell for the rest of his life. In reality, his father was an ordinary sea captain, and though the family was respected, they were far from royal lineage. At 16, just as the Napoleonic Wars were beginning, young Gregor joined the British Army. This was it, a chance for glory, medals, heroism. But instead of battlefields, he was sent to a garrison where he spent years waiting for a French invasion that never came. Boredom. For a man with his ambitions, it was torture. So he found a shortcut. If you can't earn glory in battle, you can buy it. In 1805, he married Maria Bowater, daughter of an admiral and heiress to a large fortune. Using her money, he purchased the rank of captain. He didn't earn it through sweat and blood. He simply opened his wallet. Here, we see the DNA of the future fraudster. Why take the long, hard road when you can jump straight to the reward? Why be something when you can simply appear to be it? His military career never truly took off. After a quarrel with a senior officer, he was forced to resign. Back in London, he reinvented himself yet again. He strolled through drawing rooms, introducing himself as Sir Gregor MacGregor, Baronet, hinting at knighthoods he never received and titles he never inherited. And you know what? People believed him. In London's title-obsessed high society, no one bothered to check. And here MacGregor learned the most important lesson of his life. If you lie boldly enough, people will believe you, especially if your lie matches their expectations. In 1811, his wife Maria died, and the money dried up. Her relatives threw him out. The army was no longer an option, and London's social scene was now far too expensive. What now? That's when he heard the rumors of revolutions sweeping across South America, of Simón Bolívar, Francisco de Miranda, and their fight for independence from Spain. It was the perfect opportunity, a new world where no one knew his questionable past, a place where he could start fresh and finally become the hero he so desperately wanted to appear to be. South America became MacGregor's testing ground, a full-dress rehearsal for his greatest con. He arrived in Venezuela, presenting himself as a seasoned British officer from a distinguished regiment, the same regiment he had fled from, incidentally, and offered his services to the revolutionaries. They believed him and gave him command of a cavalry battalion. To his credit, he performed well at first. He married advantageously once again, this time to the cousin of Simón Bolívar himself, instantly elevating him into the upper ranks of the revolutionary elite. Then came the event that became the cornerstone of his future legend. In 1816, after a failed battle, MacGregor's unit was cut off deep behind enemy lines. The situation was hopeless. Death in battle or execution in captivity awaited them. But MacGregor refused to surrender. He led his men across hundreds of miles of hostile jungle and swamp, constantly fending off Spanish troops in pursuit. This 34-day retreat was a genuine feat of military skill and sheer survival. He saved his men and brought them to safety. His fame spread across the continent. Simón Bolívar himself wrote to him, "The retreat you had the honor to execute, in my opinion, surpasses the conquest of an empire." MacGregor got what he had always wanted. He became a true, recognized hero. They called him the Xenophon of the Americas. But one act of heroism wasn't enough for him. Heroism is dangerous, unpredictable, difficult, but the reputation of a hero, that's priceless capital, and MacGregor began to cash it in. He decided it was time to act independently, and so began a series of what we might call his pilot projects. First project, the Republic of Florida. In 1817, he raised a mercenary force with American funding, promising them fertile land in Spanish-controlled Florida. He easily seized Amelia Island, declared himself leader of the new republic, hoisted a flag with a green cross, and began printing his own money, Amelia dollars. Then, when Spanish forces approached, he gathered all the real cash, boarded a ship, and sailed away, leaving his men to deal with the consequences. Second and third projects, Portobello and Rio de la Hacha. The pattern repeated with chilling precision. He recruited fresh volunteers in Britain, driven by dreams of glory and wealth. He seized a city, delivered grand speeches, granted himself flamboyant titles such as Inca of New Granada, and then, at the first sign of danger, he abandoned his followers and fled with the treasury. This time, however, the ending was far more tragic. Nearly all the men he left behind were either killed in battle or captured and executed. By 1820, MacGregor's reputation in South America was in ruins. Simón Bolívar, furious at his betrayals, declared him a traitor and ordered him shot on sight should he ever return to Venezuelan soil. All bridges were burned. MacGregor was in exile, trailed by a bloody wake of abandoned comrades and collapsed schemes. But he had gained something invaluable: experience. He learned how readily people believe grand promises. He perfected the scheme: create an illusion of legitimacy, a flag, a title, an army, issue your own securities, land, or currency, and disappear at the right moment. He had a heroic reputation validated by Bolívar himself, and a fraud blueprint tested in the field. Now he was ready for his masterpiece, ready to create and sell an entire country. And so, in 1821, the disgraced general, traitor, and con artist Gregor MacGregor returned to London. In South America, his name was cursed, and a bounty was on his head. But in London remembered him very differently. Here he was a hero, the man who led a legendary retreat through the jungle, Bolívar's comrade, a brave Scotsman who fought for liberty. No one knew about the abandoned troops, the failed ventures, the dead left in his wake. And MacGregor understood. His greatest asset wasn't wealth or titles. It was the story he told about himself. And he arrived in London at the perfect moment. Post-war Britain was experiencing an economic boom. Money was cheap, and investors were desperately searching for opportunities more exciting than dull government bonds. Latin America was the hottest trend in finance. New republics, Colombia, Peru, Chile, were issuing their first government loans on the London Stock Exchange, promising enormous returns. Shares vanished from the market like hotcakes. The entire city was swept up in a New World gold rush. And right at that moment, at the boiling point of the frenzy, our hero stepped onto the stage. And he wasn't offering just another investment. He was offering a nation. He appeared in drawing rooms and on the exchange not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. His Highness Gregor I, cacique of Poyais. His story was flawless. On the muddy, forgotten Mosquito Coast, he had found a local chief whom the British jokingly crowned as King George Frederick Augustus. With charm and several barrels of rum, McGregor convinced this king to sign a document granting him 8 million acres of swampy, uninhabitable land. That dubious scrap of paper became the foundation of his empire of lies. Returning to London, he went into full state-building mode. He didn't just claim he ruled a country, he proved it. He gave Poyais all the trappings of a real nation. A flag, the same green cross he had already used in his Florida venture, a coat of arms, featuring two indigenous figures and, for reasons known only to him, unicorns. He drafted an elaborate government structure with a three-chamber parliament and designed unique uniforms for every regiment of his non-existent army. He even opened an embassy in an upscale London neighborhood. But MacGregor's true masterpiece, his weapon of mass persuasion, was the book, a 355-page leather-bound tome titled A Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including the territory of Poyais. And the author? A certain Captain Thomas Strangeways. Of course, no such captain ever existed. It was MacGregor's own pen name, a stroke of genius. He created an independent expert who supposedly confirmed every claim he made. The book overflowed with meticulous detail, descriptions of climate and soil, maps of rivers, tables forecasting profits from cotton cultivation, and naturally, vivid illustrations of the flourishing capital city of St. Joseph. This was where MacGregor revealed himself as a true master of psychology. He instinctively used tactics that scientists would not formally describe until more than a century later. First, he employed the alpha tactic. He made his offer irresistibly attractive. He wasn't selling land, he was selling a dream. Wealth without effort, perfect health, the prestige of being a pioneer and a founder of a new nation. Second, he used the omega tactic, reducing resistance to the sale. The price of land was laughably low, 4 shillings per acre, roughly a day's wage for a laborer. What was the risk? Almost none. He played patriotism like a violin, tapping into the wounded pride of the Scots, whose nation had no colonies of its own. Buying land in Poyais became not just an investment, it became a patriotic duty. And finally, he manufactured urgency, scarcity. An opportunity like this comes once in a lifetime. Hesitate, and others will take your place. And the machine roared to life. People began buying up land certificates. Demand was so high that MacGregor raised the price several times. Hundreds of families poured their entire savings into those papers. But that was only phase 1. There was more to come. MacGregor took the next step, the London Stock Exchange. He convinced the respected bank Sir John Perring, Shaw, Barber & Co. to act as guarantor and issued Poyais government bonds worth £200,000 sterling. In today's money, that would be equivalent to several $billion. He didn't just fool ordinary people, he fooled Britain's financial system. But the pinnacle of his cynicism unfolded in the port as the first ships prepared to depart. MacGregor personally saw the settlers off. He shook their hands, wished them luck, and right there, on the dock, his agents set up an exchange counter. They offered the future citizens of Poyais the chance to trade their clunky, inconvenient British pounds and shillings, their gold and silver coins, for light, elegant Poyais dollars, freshly printed in Scotland. And people happily agreed. They handed over their real money in exchange for beautifully designed, utterly worthless bills bearing the coat of arms of a country that did not exist. The great swindle had reached its peak. The masterpiece was complete. The trap had sprung shut, and now the first victims, knowing nothing, were sailing across the Atlantic toward their doom. Autumn 1822. From the ports of London and Leith in Scotland, 2 ships depart amid cheering crowds, the Honduras Packet and the Kennersley Castle. On board, altogether, roughly 250 people. These were not desperate paupers seeking to escape misery. No, these were the educated and the prosperous. Doctors, lawyers, a banker destined to become the head of the Poyais National Bank, craftsmen with their families, young gentlemen whose parents had purchased them officer commissions in the Poyais army. They carried tools, books, formal clothing, and all their savings, converted into handsome but worthless Poyais dollars. The mood aboard was jubilant. People sang ballads about the beautiful land awaiting them across the ocean. They dreamed of future estates, thriving farms, healthy children raised in paradise. The Green Cross flag fluttered proudly above them. It was a voyage into a dream. After 2 long months at sea, in November, the Honduras Packet dropped anchor off the coast of Central America at the location marked on McGregor's maps. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Passengers put on their best dresses and suits, preparing for a ceremonial welcome in the prosperous port of St. Joseph. The captain ordered a salute from the ship's cannon to announce their arrival. The boom echoed over the water and dissolved into absolute suffocating silence. No return salute. No church bells. No sign of a city. Before them stretched only a vast, unmoving wall of wild, impassable mangroves. Excitement turned to confusion. Perhaps the captain had made a mistake, lost his bearings? They went ashore, assuming the capital must be nearby, merely hidden behind the trees. They set up a temporary camp and sent out search parties, but the parties returned empty-handed. No roads, no buildings, no trace of human settlement. Only jungle, swamp, and clouds of insects. The captain, realizing something was terribly wrong and fearing an incoming tropical storm, quietly raised anchor one night and sailed away, abandoning the settlers to their fate. And yet, even then, their faith in their prince, the cacique MacGregor, was so strong that they refused to believe they had been deceived. They convinced themselves it was all a terrible mistake, that their benefactor had been misled by his agents, that they simply needed to wait and help would surely come. In March 1823, another 200 settlers arrived aboard the Kennersley Castle. Their optimism evaporated the very moment they saw the gaunt, hollow-eyed survivors of the first group. And then nature struck. The rainy season began. Endless tropical downpours turned their camp into a foul swamp. The heat and humidity became unbearable, and with the rains came swarms of mosquitoes, clouds of insects carrying yellow fever and malaria, attacking the defenseless Europeans day and night. Hell began. People fell ill, first a few, then entire families. They shivered with fever, racked by dysentery. The two doctors who had come with them fought desperately to save lives, but their medicines ran out quickly, and the squalid conditions erased any progress they made. People lay directly on the ground under makeshift shelters of branches, too weak to stand. The camp filled with the moans of the dying and the stench of death and decay. James Hastie, a Scottish sawyer who lost 2 of his 3 children in poyais, later wrote, "It seemed as though Providence had decreed that every circumstance should unite for our destruction." The official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, who had left his family behind in Edinburgh, could not bear the horror any longer. He put a pistol to his head and ended his life. Rescue came far too late and purely by chance. In May 1823, a schooner called the Mexican Eagle happened to pass along the coast. On board was the Chief Justice of the neighboring British colony of Belize. Spotting people on shore dressed in European clothing, he ordered the ship to approach and went ashore to hear their story. He looked at the emaciated, dying settlers and delivered the final verdict on their dream. "There is no such country as Poyais. I have never heard of any cacique." Those who could still stand were taken to Belize. But even there, their ordeal did not end. Their weakened bodies could no longer fight off disease. People continued to die in the hospitals of Belize and on the ships that carried them back to Britain. When, in the autumn of 1823, the first survivors, ghost-like, barely alive, stepped ashore in London, the death toll was horrifying. Of the roughly 250 optimists who had sailed off to paradise, at least 180 were dead. Fewer than 50 ever made it home. The dream Gregor MacGregor sold them had become, for most, a mass grave in an anonymous jungle. News of the settlers' tragedy reached London at almost the same time as the first survivors in the fall of 1823. The newspapers exploded with scandalous headlines. Tales of children dying in the jungle, of fever, hunger, and despair shook British society. The name Gregor MacGregor, admired only yesterday, was now spoken like a curse. Crowds of furious investors and grieving relatives demanded that the swindler be found and punished. An official inquiry began. It seemed that the conman's career was finally over. Trial, and perhaps the gallows, appeared inevitable. But where was the Prince of Poyais? The prince, guided by an almost animal instinct for self-preservation, had left London weeks before the first ship of survivors arrived. He had prudently gone to Paris, supposedly so that his wife could recover her health in a milder climate. And while Britain raged with scandal, MacGregor, utterly unbothered, simply started over. It sounds insane, but as soon as he arrived in France, he relaunched the poyais scheme from scratch. The same story of a tropical paradise. The same promises of limitless wealth. He found new partners, a trading concern called the Compagnie de la Nouvelle Industrie, and sold them the rights to 500,000 acres of land that did not exist. He had his famous guidebook translated into French, printed new promotional pamphlets, and began recruiting a fresh wave of settlers. Here we see one of the most striking traits of MacGregor's psychology. He wasn't just a con artist, he was a pathological liar who seemed to believe his own inventions. Or, more likely, he had such contempt for human credulity that he saw no reason to stop. He went even bigger this time. He published a new constitution for poyais, now as a republic, of course, with himself still installed as lifelong president and cacique. He even attempted to float a new government loan for £300,000. But French bureaucracy proved less gullible than British investors. When the passport office suddenly received several dozen applications to emigrate to a country no one had ever heard of, poyais, officials raised the alarm. The police opened an investigation. The ship carrying the new settlers was seized right in the port of Le Havre before it could sail. And in September 1825, Gregor MacGregor himself was arrested. At last, the moment of truth, or so it seemed. The elusive swindler finally found himself behind bars in the notorious La Force prison in Paris. A trial was inevitable, and when it finally took place in 1826, something almost unbelievable happened. McGregor did not behave like a defendant. He acted like an insulted monarch. He declared his arrest a political conspiracy, an attempt to undermine the independence of his young nation. His lawyer built a defense around the claim that McGregor himself had been deceived by his French partners who conveniently had fled. And the French court believed him. The prosecutor declared that there was insufficient evidence of malicious intent on the part of this respected general and hero. MacGregor was acquitted, completely. It was as if the man were coated in Teflon. Nothing stuck to him. He walked out of the courtroom a victor and immediately returned to London. Yes, to that very same London where he should have been hated. But several years had passed. The scandal had faded. An economic downturn had made people once again hungry for risky, get-rich-quick opportunities. And MacGregor opened a new Office for Poyais Affairs. No embassies this time, no grand receptions, but he started selling land again. He even managed to launch one last bond issue for £800,000. Granted, almost no one wanted to buy it anymore. For the last 15 years of his grand deception, McGregor's empire existed in a state of slow, pitiful decay. He kept selling land certificates, using them to pay off old creditors. Other swindlers began to copy his scheme, opening their own poyais offices and selling the same imaginary land, competing with him for victims. Even the new king of the Mosquito Coast, the successor of the very chief who had signed MacGregor's original deed, started issuing his own bogus land grants to claim a share of the spoils. The great con had turned into satire. Poyais had played itself out, as one biographer later wrote. MacGregor, the man who built and sold an empire of lies, had dwindled into a petty grifter, hawking empty promises at the margins of the financial world. It seemed he was headed for a wretched end, poverty, disgrace, and oblivion. But fate had prepared for him one last twist, the most cynical twist of all. 1838. Gregor MacGregor had lost everything. His life's masterpiece, the nation of poyais, had become a bad joke whispered on the streets of London. His money was gone. His loyal wife Josepha, who had followed him through every adventure from the battlefields of Venezuela to the prison cells of Paris, had died. He was alone in cold, rainy Edinburgh, haunted by the ghosts of ruined investors and the shadows of settlers who had died in the jungle. He was past 50. What now? A debtor's prison? A miserable end in poverty? For any other man, yes, but not for Gregor MacGregor. He decided to make one final, desperate, insane move. He chose to return to Venezuela. Pause for a moment and consider the madness of this decision. He was returning to a country where his former ally and relative by marriage, Simón Bolívar, had personally ordered him executed on sight. He was sailing straight toward what should have been his own death sentence. It looked like suicide, or like the final, all-or-nothing gamble of a man who had nothing left to lose. He stepped ashore in Caracas prepared for anything. And here, just when the audience expects the inevitable reckoning, fate delivers the most cynical twist in an already unbelievable story. Instead of clanking chains and shouts of traitor, MacGregor was greeted by silence, then surprise, then recognition. In the nearly 20 years he had been away, everything had changed. Bolívar had died in 1830, his popularity greatly diminished by the end. The execution order had been forgotten. New men were in power now. And these men were McGregor's old comrades in arms. And what did they remember of Gregor MacGregor? They knew nothing of poyais. They had never heard about Amelia Island, or Portobello, or Rio de la Hacha. Memory is selective, and history is written by the survivors. To them, MacGregor was not a fraud, but a hero, the brave Scottish general who in 1816 had achieved the impossible, leading his men through enemy jungles and saving hundreds of lives. His one true heroic act outweighed and overshadowed everything he had done since. MacGregor, sensing this immediately, played his final hand with brilliance. He didn't hide. He didn't beg. He submitted a formal petition to the Venezuelan government, and the audacity of his demands was breathtaking. He asked for three things. First, full Venezuelan citizenship. Second, restoration of his rank as a divisional general. And third, the most incredible of all, 20 years begged, worth of back pay, plus a lifetime pension. He portrayed himself as a victim, an exile who had suffered for decades, longing to return to his second homeland. And the government, led by men who had once served under him, considered his petition. The Minister of War, who had personally fought under MacGregor during the legendary retreat, delivered an impassioned speech in his defense. And in March 1839, every one of McGregor's demands was granted. Every single one. For the last 7 years of his life, the greatest con artist in history lived exactly as he had always dreamed. He was rich, he was respected, he was a general, a living legend of the War for Independence, an honored citizen of Caracas. He died peacefully in his bed on December 4th, 1845. But even that was not the end. The final note of this story came at his funeral. Gregor MacGregor was buried not as a swindler, but as a national hero, with full military honors. Behind his coffin, draped in the Venezuelan flag, walked the President of the Republic, every minister, and the entire high command of the Venezuelan army. Newspapers in Caracas published glowing obituaries praising his heroic and triumphant retreat, calling him a valiant champion of independence. There was not a single word about Amelia Island, or Portobello, or Rio de la Hacha, and certainly nothing about the cacique of Poyais. Sometimes, in real life, unlike in the movies, evil goes unpunished. Sometimes the greatest liars and villains not only escape justice, but die in honor, wrapped in the glory they invented for themselves. And the land he named Poyais, that very patch of coast on the Mosquito Shore, remains to this day wild, untouched jungle. A silent, overgrown monument to one of the boldest, cruelest, and astonishingly most successful frauds in the history of humankind.